Today, we are diving into one of the wildest legal puzzles in modern history. Seriously, it's a story about a country, a court case, and a reality that seemed to just get rewritten years after the fact. And it really all comes down to this one almost unbelievable question. Can you actually erase a court's final decision years later by arguing that one of the countries in the case, well, that it never really existed to begin with? Okay, so here's the core of the problem. On one hand, you've got the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1996 saying, hey, we're the same old Yugoslavia. We've had a UN seat for ages. But then, bam, 4 years later in 2000, that very same state gets admitted to the United Nations as a totally new member. So which is it? You can't be both, right? And that contradiction is what lit the fuse for this entire legal explosion. Now, to really wrap our heads around this, we have to go back in time, back to the tragic conflict where this whole thing started. So you remember the early 90s? The old Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia collapses? A new state, the FRY, pops up and claims it's just the continuation of the old one. Right in the middle of all this, Bosnia and Herzegovina takes the FRY to the International Court of Justice, alleging genocide. And in 1996, the court makes a huge decision. It says, yes, we have jurisdiction, we can hear this case. At that point, it seemed like the path was set. For a while, anyway. But this is where the story takes a massive, unexpected turn. 5 years after that ruling, Yugoslavia came back to court with an argument so radical, it threatened to tear the whole thing down. And listen, this wasn't just a simple appeal, not at all. This was a wild attempt to completely revise the 1996 judgment, to literally wipe it off the books, based on what they called a new fact. And here's their big argument. It's a real head-scratcher. They said that their admission to the UN in 2000 wasn't just some political ceremony. No, they claimed it was the discovery of a fact that proved the real truth all along. That back in 1996, when the court made its original decision, they weren't actually a member of the United Nations. And you can see the logic they were building, right? It was like a row of dominoes. They said if they weren't a UN member in 96, then domino 1, they weren't a party to the court's own rules. Domino 2, if that's true, then they weren't bound by the Genocide Convention. Domino 3, if that's true, the court never had the authority, the jurisdiction, to hear the case in the first place. And the final domino to fall, the entire 1996 judgment just disappears. Poof. Invalid. So you can imagine, the court is now faced with this extraordinary, reality-bending request. But they can't just make a gut call. There are rules for this. Very, very strict rules. And that rulebook is called Article 61 of the court statute. Think of it as the break glass in case of emergency button for judgments. It lets you reopen a case, but it is almost never used. And that's on purpose. The bar is set incredibly high to make sure that court decisions are final and stable. You can't just try to get a do-over. So Yugoslavia had to pass this incredibly tough test. The court had to ask, 1, is this even a fact? 2, is it so important that it would have changed the entire original outcome? 3, was it genuinely unknown to everybody back then? And 4, and this is the absolute kicker, did this so-called fact actually exist back in 1996, even if nobody knew about it? So, this all builds up to the moment of truth. The judges have heard all the arguments. Now they have to take that super strict 4-part test and apply it to Yugoslavia's bombshell claim. The entire case, everything, really just hung on this one single time-bending question. Was getting into the UN in 2000 a brand new event? Or was it just pulling the curtain back on a truth that was there all along, hidden in plain sight? What do you think? Well, the court's answer was pretty blunt, and I'm going to quote them directly here because it's so clear. They said, a fact which occurs several years after a judgment has been given is not a new fact within the meaning of Article 61. End of story. In other words, you can't use something that happened in the future to change the past. So the verdict was in. Yugoslavia's application was thrown out, inadmissible. That original 1996 judgment was not going to be erased. It was going to stand. So the court basically drew a really firm line. They said that Yugoslavia was confusing an event, which was getting into the UN in 2000, with the discovery of an old fact. They argued you just can't take the legal consequences of something that happened in 2000 and use a time machine to project them backward and change the legal reality of 1996. For the sake of law and order, the past is the past. But, and this is a big but, if you think everyone just nodded and went home, you are mistaken. Because while the majority ruled, the decision was nowhere near unanimous. And this is where the debate gets really fascinating. The final vote was 10-3. Now that is a big deal. That's a serious split among some of the world's most brilliant legal minds. 3 judges thought the majority had gotten it completely wrong. And their arguments were powerful. These dissenting judges basically said, come on, people. They believed the 2000 admission wasn't a new event, but that it revealed the truth that had existed all along. The FRY was never a UN member in 1996. They felt the court's original decision was based on a massive error, and that now the majority was just hiding behind a tiny legal technicality to avoid admitting it made a mistake. They said the court was ignoring the legal reality of what actually happened. And that's what this whole bizarre case leaves us with. It forces us to ask this really deep question about how law works. Was the court sticking to the rules to protect the stability of justice, which is absolutely crucial? Or was it using a rule as a shield to avoid facing an uncomfortable truth about its own mistake and maybe obscuring what really happened? It's a fundamental debate that still echoes through international law today.